of the Voting Rights Act. So as Carla mentioned, people's lines will be muted for the first part of the webinar, and that'll take about 30 minutes. And then after that, after the 30-minute presentation, we'll have Q&A for the remainder of the webinar time. So let's go over an overview of what this webinar covers. There are a number of topics listed on this slide here, and in the first webinar we covered the first 5 topics on this list, which ranged from an overview of Section 203 and an introduction to Section 203 advocacy. It also covered a few specific implementation issues, such as determining what languages to provide assistance in, as well as written materials. This second webinar covers some additional specific issues around implementation, including publicity and outreach leading up to Election Day, some topics around bilingual poll workers, specifically recruitment, training, and targeting. And then lastly, we'll cover some general practices in Section 203 implementation. We'll be doing a webinar later on a separate topic around poll monitoring, specifically how to organize poll monitoring efforts, which is basically recruiting and training volunteers to observe poll sites on Election Day. On the slide here is a website that's listed, and an archived version of both this webinar and the first webinar will be posted here at a later date, along with copies of the PowerPoint. Also, there is a Section 203 advocacy manual that the Asian American Center for Advancing Justice has released, and that manual is posted at this website link here. And we'll repeat it again at the end of the webinar just so folks have this link. So that's an overview of this webinar as well as what the first webinar covered. So let's dive into some of these topics here. So let's talk about pre-election publicity and outreach. In the first webinar, we talked about how the U.S. Department of Justice has put out regulations spelling out the DOJ's view on what jurisdictions should be doing to comply with Section 203. So the DOJ guidance on this topic talks about how jurisdictions covered by Section 203, cities, in other words, cities and counties covered by Section 203, how those jurisdictions should be taking appropriate steps to publicize the fact that translated materials are available and that bilingual oral assistance is available. So in other words, jurisdictions have an obligation to let voters know that there is language assistance available. And this is important in general, and it's particularly important for jurisdictions with new language requirements. In the first webinar, we talked about how in October 2011, the Census Bureau released a new list of jurisdictions covered by Section 203 and how many jurisdictions have new language requirements. So this kind of publicity and outreach is important in general, but it's particularly critical in jurisdictions with new language requirements. And that's because until now, voters did not have language assistance under Section 203, where there are these new language requirements, and it's important for voters to know that they have this language assistance now. It's also important for voters to know that they can request that translated materials be sent to them before Election Day in the mail. So for example, things like translated voter guides and translated sample ballots can be mailed to voters prior to Election Day. And then there's some voters who vote by mail, or another term is absentee ballot. And that's another set of materials that voters can request translated versions of. Let's go to a couple of implementation items around publicity and outreach. So we've talked about the DOJ's view that jurisdictions should be publicizing language assistance. How do jurisdictions do that? There are a couple things that election officials can do. election officials can use ethnic media to publicize the fact that language assistance is available. Election officials should be using ethnic media to disseminate election information in general for Section 203 language groups, and then they should also be using ethnic media to let voters know that the language assistance is available. There are a couple of things that election officials can use ethnic media for, and a couple of things that election officials can do. One thing is to ask ethnic media outlets to run public service announcements, or PSAs, to let voters know that language assistance is available in upcoming elections. Another thing that election officials can do is to work with community groups or community members to see if there are earned media opportunities. In other words, chances for getting free media. This could be something like a community member and someone from the Registrar of Voters teaming up and going on a TV show, a TV talk show, for example, in an ethnic media outlet and talking about how language assistance is available. Or radio spots or op-eds in ethnic newspapers. Those are some examples of earned media opportunities that might be available. And then lastly, it's important for election officials to add ethnic media outlets to their press list. So what can community members do here? There are a couple of things. A lot of community groups have very good relationships with ethnic media, and they have good ethnic media lists. So you can put election officials in touch with ethnic media. We would say that at a minimum, it's very important to share your ethnic media list with election officials, since community groups may have much better ethnic media lists than what election officials might have access to. And then going a step further, if possible, it's very helpful to introduce your registrar of voters to your ethnic media contacts. This is so the registrar can develop its own relationship with ethnic media, and it's also a chance for registrars to learn from newspaper editors and radio channels about what their distribution looks like geographically and what kind of audience they have. So these are some things that community members can do to help election officials better use ethnic media, all with the common goal of getting the word out about language assistance. In addition to ethnic media, election officials should be doing outreach to community members. They can do things like form partnerships with CBOs to publicize language assistance. Election officials can ask community groups to do things like email blasts to their membership list. What's very common also is for election officials to send outreach staff to community events and gathering places. And that's something that election officials can do partnering with CBOs or on their own, but either way, it's a very good practice for election officials to do. And they should do this to spread the word about language assistance. It's also a way for election officials to help recruit bilingual poll workers. They can set up a booth at a festival or some other community event and give out poll worker recruitment forms. And then lastly, just generally speaking, it really helps raise the visibility of elections within the covered language minority community. So election officials, as we've talked about, can work with ethnic media, can work with community groups, and have a presence at community events. Election officials can also do direct outreach to language minority voters. Election officials can do things like do a mailing, a postcard mailing, or some other mailing to voters to let them know that there's language assistance and that they can sign up for translated materials to be sent to them prior to Election Day. This is a way of getting the word out directly to voters. Sometimes election officials may be reluctant to conduct this kind of outreach And if that's the case, what community members can do is remind election officials that voter requests for language assistance can be another source of helpful data to target language assistance. In other words, if election officials can build a file of voters who have requested language assistance, they can use that to figure out where there are needs for language assistance within the jurisdiction. And it's helpful to remind election officials about that if they're reluctant to do direct mailings to voters. Another issue that sometimes comes up is that election officials are reluctant to do a mailing like this to all voters within their jurisdiction. And in an ideal world, they would do that, but if they're reluctant to do that kind of mailing to all voters, they can find some ways of targeting the mailing, for example, by sending it to voters whose names match an ethnic name list, or to send a mailing to foreign-born voters. Again, in an ideal world, election officials would do this kind of mailing to all voters, but if they're reluctant to do that, they can target that sort of mailing. So these are some things that election officials can and should be doing around publicity and outreach leading up to Election Day, and some things that community members can do to help election officials in that effort. Let's switch to another topic, which is poll workers, specifically recruitment of poll workers, training poll workers, and figuring out where to have bilingual poll workers. So let's start here with what the DOJ says about a jurisdiction's obligation to provide oral assistance. So there's a difference here from written assistance. For oral assistance, the jurisdiction is going to be required to provide assistance in multiple languages or dialects if multiple languages or dialects are commonly used by members of the language group. The difference here from written assistance is that for written assistance, the DOJ says a jurisdiction can choose one language or one form of a language to provide the written assistance in, although nothing stops the jurisdiction from providing written assistance in multiple languages or dialects, or multiple languages or forms, I mean. So that's written assistance, but for oral assistance, the jurisdiction should provide assistance in whatever languages or dialects are commonly used by members of the language minority group. So, for example, if a jurisdiction is covered for Chinese Americans, then the jurisdiction can choose whether to provide assistance in traditional or simplified Chinese as far as written assistance goes. But for bilingual poll workers and interpreters, the jurisdiction should identify what dialects are commonly used by voters, and that could be both Mandarin and Cantonese for that particular jurisdiction. It could be additional dialects as well. So that's the DOJ guidance on oral assistance. In other words, however many languages or dialects are commonly used by members of the language group. Let's talk about poll worker targeting. In the first webinar, we talked about the concept of targeting, which means that a jurisdiction provides assistance at less than all poll sites in the jurisdiction. In other words, the jurisdiction figures out which poll sites have large numbers of voters with language needs and provides assistance at those poll sites, but not all poll sites in the jurisdiction. So the DOJ guidelines allow jurisdictions to do this, but the targeted assistance still has to be effective. One key element in making sure that targeted assistance is still effective is that election officials use sound methodology to identify poll sites where the language assistance is needed. And there are a couple of things that election officials should be encouraged to do on this front. One is to consult with community groups on how poll sites will be targeted. Another is to use a variety of data to identify poll sites where language assistance should be provided. And these data range from using place of birth information, using ethnic name matching, census data, voter request for language assistance, as well as information provided by community members. For example, community members telling the registrar there's a senior center here or a community center there, and despite whatever other data may say, there's a need for language assistance within the population here. The key point here is that it's good for election officials to use multiple data points here, since no one data set may necessarily identify all poll sites where there's a need for language assistance. Community members can do some other things as beyond this. One is to ask election officials to provide a list of poll sites at which they plan to provide language assistance, and community members can see whether that list looks comprehensive or whether it's missing some areas where there is a need for language assistance based on your experience and your work. So that's another thing that community members can do, in addition to the things listed on this PowerPoint slide here. Let's move on to recruitment of bilingual poll workers. So bilingual poll worker recruitment can be a challenge. Recruiting poll workers in general can be a challenge, and that's because being a poll worker is a long day. It's often a 14 to 16-hour shift, and the pay can be $50, $100, $200, depends on what the jurisdiction's practice is. But the general point being is it's not an enormous amount of money, given that the election day tends to be 14 to 16 hours long. And so in general, it can be a challenge to recruit poll workers, and by the same token, it can be a challenge to recruit bilingual poll workers. But the good thing is there are some practices that election officials have used successfully to recruit bilingual poll workers. For example, we've seen some jurisdictions form partnerships with other government agencies, other government departments, to identify bilingual government employees and to recruit them to be poll workers on election day. We've also seen some jurisdictions partner with high schools and colleges to recruit bilingual students to be poll workers or interpreters. That's another practice that jurisdictions can consider. We've worked with some ethnic media outlets and election officials to get PSAs run, public service announcements run, to let the public know about opportunities to serve as poll workers, with these PSAs being run in ethnic media outlets. Another practice is to partner with CBOs. So election officials can ask CBOs to send out email blasts about poll workers, or to talk about serving as a poll worker at their staff meetings. That's another practice that can be successful. The last thing to mention on poll worker recruitment is that it's good for election officials to aim high, and by that I mean to recruit more bilingual poll workers than they actually assign to poll sites on election day. It's good for election officials to have a backup pool, a reserve pool of bilingual poll workers, and that's because on election day, invariably, some poll workers don't show up, and that includes bilingual poll workers. And also, there are poll sites where a bilingual poll worker wasn't assigned, but we find out there's a need for a bilingual poll worker at that poll site. And in those cases, it's good to have some bilingual poll workers on call who can be sent out to those kinds of poll sites. So that's another practice that election officials should be encouraged to do in order to make sure that the oral assistance is effective. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about poll worker training. The basic point here is that election officials should make sure that poll workers are trained adequately on language assistance and cultural sensitivity. Many of the problems that arise on election day can be attributed to either poor poll worker training or poll workers not paying attention during poll worker training. And better training practices can help reduce the likelihood that these problems are going to happen in the first place. So poll worker trainings are a challenge for election officials because these trainings have to cover a lot of material. They have to cover how poll workers set up the poll site, how to set up voting machines. These trainings have to cover election procedures, how to check in voters into the roster. They also have to cover breaking down the poll site once election day is over. So there's a lot of content in these poll worker trainings, but all that said, trainings do need to spend an adequate amount of time on language assistance and cultural sensitivity. So for example, poll worker training should be spending more than one slide during a PowerPoint presentation, and training should be devoting more than 2 minutes to language assistance during a 90-minute training. So there needs to be a good amount of time during these trainings on language assistance and cultural sensitivity, and not just lip service. Another thing that's helpful for election officials to do is to give community groups an opportunity to review draft poll worker training materials. And the key here is that community groups get to look at drafts rather than the final version where changes aren't possible. This means that community groups should ask their election officials to get these drafts at least a couple months before election day, so that they can look at these materials, for example, to look at PowerPoint or proposed videos, and provide comments comments early on enough so that election officials can make changes to them before they become final. Another thing that community groups can do is to observe poll worker trainings. What we've done from time to time is to ask the registrar to put on basically a final dress rehearsal for poll worker trainings, and we provide some comments to help fine-tune these trainings. So that's another thing that can be done. Additionally, community groups can see if they can conduct presentations or workshops as part of poll worker trainings, or if not as part of the trainings, at least to do these presentations to the permanent staff working for registrars. And if not, in addition, if these presentations can't be part of poll worker trainings themselves, to have separate modules in place. So for example, community groups can partner with the registrar to develop an online module on language assistance that could augment what was covered during the regular poll worker training. So those are some things that community groups can do to make sure that poll worker training covers language assistance adequately. One last thing on poll workers is that sometimes training is not enough, and poll workers mistreat voters, or they have a negative view of language assistance, and that does happen from time to time. And because it does happen occasionally, election officials should have some sort of system in place for handling complaints about poll workers. This includes two things. One is the ability to address these problems on the spot during election day, and to get a poll worker removed if necessary, or to get someone from the registrar's office to talk to the poll worker. And then the second part of this is having a process after Election Day where registrar staff counsel poll workers on things that the poll workers shouldn't have done or what the poll workers should have done differently. So we're going to finish talking about the poll workers there and move to some general practices that are helpful for election officials to follow in terms of Section 203 work. One thing that's very helpful is for election officials to form an advisory committee made up of community members, including community groups that work with or serve language minority voters. These advisory committees are helpful because they can help the registrar vet plans for recruiting bilingual poll workers. They can help review translation drafts. They can help the registrar work with ethnic media. Another part of having a formal advisory committee is that it ensures there's some sort of systematic communication going on between the registrar and members of the community. Another thing that election officials should do is to hire election staff who are responsible for coordinating the jurisdiction's efforts to comply with Section 203. Oftentimes, these staffers are called language minority coordinators, but whatever the title is, the point is that the registrar have a staffer devoted to making sure that language assistance is accurately provided. Some jurisdictions are covered for multiple language minority groups under Section 203, and in that kind of situation, what's helpful is for the registrar to have language minority coordinators who are familiar with each of those language minority communities. Another thing that's important for election officials to do is to have a troubleshooter team on Election Day. These are folks who go out to poll sites on Election Day, and they make sure that poll sites are running smoothly, and they check for things like missing bilingual poll workers or translated materials. It could be something like one troubleshooter assigned to 10 poll sites or 15 poll sites, but whatever the ratio, the idea is that the registrar is sending out its own team of troubleshooters to check up on poll sites and also to be equipped to resolve these problems on Election Day. Someone who can go to a poll site and talk to poll workers if election procedures are not being followed properly, or to bring out replacement supplies of translated materials, things like that. The last item on this slide is the jurisdiction's voter hotline. So the jurisdiction needs to make sure that its voter hotline has multilingual capacity for the Section 203 languages it's covered for. Some jurisdictions use a recorded message that voters hear when they call the number, and if that's the case, then that recorded message needs to be multilingual and able to direct voters to press 1, 2, or 3, and so on for the language that the voter needs. Ideally, these voter hotlines should be staffed by live staffers rather than a recorded message. And if that's not possible all throughout the year, then certainly at least around election times, these voter hotlines should be using live staff to the extent possible. One last general practice to cover here is with respect to another provision of the Voting Rights Act, which is Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 208 applies everywhere across the country, regardless of what the population looks like. And it's an important complement to Section 203. Section 208 says that voters have the right to receive assistance in the voting booth by someone of their choice. There are a couple of exceptions here. A voter doesn't have this right to get assistance from someone from their employer or someone from their union, but other than those exceptions, voters can get assistance from whoever they choose, even if that person is not a citizen or even if that person is under 18. So this is an important right that applies even in non-Section 203 jurisdictions. And unfortunately, it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention, and it's something that poll workers are sometimes not aware of. So what community members can do is ask their election officials to make sure that Section 208 gets sufficient attention during poll worker training so that poll workers don't mistakenly deny voters the ability to bring in someone into the voting booth. All right, we're going to wrap up our presentation here and head into questions and answers. Before we do that, just wanted to mention again that archived versions of this webinar and the first webinar will be posted at the website link here at a later point, along with the PowerPoint. In addition, the Asian American Center for Advancing Justice has released the Section 203 Advocacy Manual, which goes into more detail in some of the things that have been covered in these webinars. That handbook is posted at the link here as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Carlo for questions and answers.
So once again, if folks want to just either type in questions into the chat box or use the question box or just raise your hand, we can begin collecting questions now. So Eugene, we have a question from Mark Masoka from AppCon in Los Angeles. You mentioned the register is expected to monitor its efforts to serve language minorities. How do you approach this register about these requests?
The question was about registrars being expected to monitor? Is that the question?
So I believe the question, and Mark, I can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question directly.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the registrar, and I was going to ask whether that was the state level or at the county or city level, and then given that they may not, the ones who will be focusing in are likely not to be doing this. What are the means by which you would ask about what their efforts are and what steps they will be doing to monitor the results of their efforts?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, as we mentioned in the first webinar, county election officials are the ones typically responsible for the nuts and bolts of elections. State officials, specifically the Secretary of State, in most states, the Secretary of State is the state's chief elections officer and has some sort of oversight role of how elections are carried out. But in our experience, the Secretary of State has not really been has played a vital role in overseeing how counties carry out their Section 203 obligations. In terms of the advocacy that community members can do, it's for most cases, it's directly with the county election official. The stance that community members take, generally it's going to be most helpful if it's framed as a partnership with election officials, but there are cases where election officials are not particularly willing to work with community members, which is unfortunate, but it does happen from time to time. And that's where, as we covered in the first webinar, that's where community members can talk to the registrar and point them back to the DOJ regulations, which talk about how Section 203 compliance is going to be assessed, in part at least, to the degree to which the election official has worked with community members. In terms of expectations for county officials to monitor their own performance, that's something they should be doing. Generally speaking, many election officials we work with are moving towards some sort of performance assessment techniques through poll worker surveys and other ways of analyzing data from how they've conducted elections. On election day itself, as we've just talked about, it's important for election officials to have some sort of troubleshooter team. Another term for these are precinct coordinators. So these are folks who are not poll workers themselves, but they do work for the registrar, and they go around to poll sites on election day, checking up on poll sites, and also trying to address problems that arise. And these troubleshooters work very similarly to what poll monitors do. Both third-party poll monitors sent out by community groups and the registrar's troubleshooters, they both have this goal of checking up on poll sites and getting problems addressed. So that's an important way for county election officials to monitor their performance. They need to have people out there in the field getting firsthand accounts of what's happening at poll sites on election day.
So Eugene, we also have two more questions that have come in.
Mm-hmm.
One question asks about Section 203 and 208 advocacy handbooks. I believe the question is just how can groups go about requesting these Section 203 and 208 handbooks from the, I believe the question is directed towards us, so how can they request them from us?
Mm-hmm.
And my suggestion is that for folks that want to just download the digital PDF version, it's available online now at the link provided on the slide. But if folks want hard copy of the advocacy manual, we're more than happy to mail those copies to you. Just go ahead and email your request to us directly, and we can go ahead and ship those out. And the advocacy handbook is there's no cost associated with it, and we're happy to mail it out to you free of charge as well. Eugene, was there anything else you wanted to add about how CBOs can request these language materials from us or from the registrar?
No.
Okay, great. So the second question that came in was from Cindy, and it asked for a group of volunteers with extremely limited to no budget, what are the priorities that should be concentrated on for Section 203 work?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very important question, and I don't know if there's a simple answer. I think the first thing that needs to be done is to figure out where the registrar is in terms of its plans for providing language assistance and seeing what gaps there are potentially. If the registrar looks like it's got a good handle in terms of its plans for translated materials, then probably, but the registrar seems to be struggling with bilingual poll worker recruitment, then that's an indication of where a volunteer group's efforts should be directed. So the first step is to assess where the registrar is and figure out what the gaps are. The other thing I would mention is it's in a situation where you're with a group of volunteers with limited resources. Another helpful thing to do is try to get the registrar up to speed as much as possible so that the registrar, which presumably has more resources with its budget, to try to get the registrar up to speed so that it can access resources and help itself. So, for example, what we covered today about working with ethnic media, it'd be really helpful for groups with limited resources to make sure that the registrar gets familiar with ethnic media and is able to navigate that on its own, so that your volunteer group, which may not have time to help the registrar work with ethnic media, if you can do that, then the registrar is able to work those ethnic media opportunities on its own. That's another thing that would be very helpful to get the registrar up to speed on. And then the other thing is that I would mention here is bilingual poll worker recruitment. So making sure the registrar is taking advantage of some of the practices that we covered today. Oftentimes community groups are asked by election officials to help find bilingual poll workers, and it's helpful for community groups to do that, but where a group has limited resources, then what's helpful is to point the registrar to some things it could be doing on its own to find bilingual poll workers.
So Eugene, we have another question regarding voluntarily translations. So the question reads, can CBOs ask the county or election officials to translate the materials into a minority language that has never been translated in government materials before? And so this question came from Gerving. Apologize if I mispronounced that. But I will actually unmute you so you can ask your question to Eugene directly, because the answer may depend on what specific communities you're working with and whether it's looking for oral assistance in writing or verbal oral assistance.
You are unmuted.
So you're muted right now. Would you like to ask your questions to Eugene directly?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, I have a question if we need further assistance or have any questions pertaining to the voting rights, can we contact your agency?
Yes, please feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to talk with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Carl, I think there was a... Go ahead.
Yeah. Do you want to address the first question, which also came from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's nothing to stop a jurisdiction from voluntarily translating materials into non-Section 203 languages, and that's been done before in some places. For example, before LA County became covered for Korean under the Voting Rights Act, it voluntarily provided assistance in Korean. And there are other examples as well. What's helpful for community members to do is to show a need for that language assistance, which can be done through data. It can be done through anecdotal information. And it can be done in the form of a coordinated advocacy campaign. And those are things that are helpful to actually get the jurisdiction to agree to provide that voluntary assistance. I think it's also helpful to think about what materials you would want to prioritize to be translated. And that's because when a jurisdiction does voluntarily provide assistance, it may be unable to translate every single voting material in language. And so for that reason, it'd be helpful to think about prioritizing what materials should be translated first on a voluntary basis. Another suggestion, which someone from Asian Law Alliance provided is, and this is a very helpful practice, is for jurisdictions or community members to ask ethnic media to translate election information and publish it in ethnic newspapers. And this can be a win-win situation because the community will have access to translated materials, and then the ethnic media outlet hopefully will be able to sell more newspapers. So it's something that can work out for all parties there.
Eugene, I have a question.
Yes.
Couldn't we approach the county and ask the county if we can volunteer translate the voting materials into Hmong language, because it has never been translated into Hmong language?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's also something that can be done. To go to a county and say, we know the county has a limited budget, but there's a strong need for materials in Hmong, and we can help you with translations of voting materials into Hmong.
Okay, we'll do that, and we'll probably get back to you.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great, and definitely look forward to talking with you.
So Eugene, does your last slide have any contact information for the voting rights staff from each affiliate?
No, it does not have that contact info.
Okay, so maybe at the end we can also provide some contact information that folks can utilize if they have further questions that they'd like to discuss with us offline. So another question came in, Shinjin Park. It's a question regarding Korean American voters, and so I'm going to unmute you. So if you want to ask Eugene your question directly, go ahead. You're unmuted now. Okay. Thank you for letting me know you have no microphone. Okay, so this is a question from the Korean American Voters Council in New Jersey regarding the number of bilingual poll workers at a poll site. Is there any recommended formula that we can present to election officials, such as at least 2 bilingual poll workers at the poll site within 50 Korean voters? We are not sure which poll sites to ask to deploy bilingual poll workers to.
Well, that's a great question, a very important question, and it gets to some tricky issues. Earlier in the webinar, we talked about how election officials should be encouraged to use multiple sources of targeting data, including voter requests for language assistance, place of birth, census data, ethnic name matching. But another part of the equation is what is the threshold for assigning bilingual poll workers? And that's what the question gets at. You know, what is the recommended threshold? And I guess the way I would suggest approaching it is looking at it from the other way around, to think about what poll sites one would want bilingual poll workers, and to figure out what kind of threshold gets you to that place. And you know, one could ask the registrar to provide a list of poll sites and the corresponding data. So in other words, if a registrar is thinking about providing bilingual poll workers at each poll site where Korean American voters are 5% of the precinct, go ahead and ask the registrar for that list, but also to indicate which precincts are at 4% or at 3%, and to look at those precincts and figure out whether those are in areas with a large language need. And if that's the case, then that 5% threshold doesn't seem to be adequate, and you can go back to the registrar and ask the registrar to lower that threshold. You know, in terms of recommending certain formulas, that's hard to do because election practices vary by jurisdiction, voter turnout rates vary by by jurisdiction. So in one jurisdiction, if you have this general rule of one bilingual poll worker for 50 Korean American voters, that might work for that jurisdiction. But in another jurisdiction where turnout is, let's say, particularly high, then additional poll workers may be needed because there are going to be more voters coming into that polling place who may need language assistance. So it's hard to have a general rule that fits across all jurisdictions because it does vary. Things do vary by jurisdiction. So again, the way I would suggest approaching it is to figure out which areas there are significant language needs based on the experience you've had working with communities, and to figure out what threshold is going to get you to the kind of coverage you want.
Okay, we have one more question. And so this question relates to the different entities that are involved in 203 compliance. So with the different entities that are involved in covered jurisdictions with 203, how can you suggest CBOs address the disparity between the accuracy and the quality of translations across the different entities? For example, Secretary of State, county election officials, county voter register.
That's a good question, and that's because election officials, in a lot of states, election officials are not all prepared by just one entity. In California, for example, the majority of voting materials are produced by county election officials. But that said, there are some materials produced by the Secretary of State, including a statewide voter bill of rights. There's also a statewide voter information guide. And so there are multiple entities doing these translations, which makes it more difficult on the advocacy side to make sure that there are accurate translations. There are some things that can be done outside of Section 203 advocacy itself. This is more on the policy side, but in California, just as an example, there was legislation passed a couple years ago that required the Secretary of State to establish an advisory committee to help look at translation quality for specific statewide materials, and that was a way to force the Secretary of State to make sure there was a community review process for some translated materials. So that's something that is worth considering to help make sure there are some community checks on translation quality.
So the last question I see right now is regarding when copies of the PowerPoint will be made available. And again, the archived version of this video webinar will be available on the Section 203 section website at the Asian American Center at the Asian American Justice Center by early next week. But copies of the PDF for this PowerPoint will be made available tomorrow morning. And if you need it today, then it's on the availability of Eugene. So Eugene, do you think that is something that can be made available later this afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So for folks who need it more urgently than tomorrow morning, we can email it to you directly. Any other questions so far? Okay, Eugene, do you want to briefly describe some of the logistics for our next webinar?
Sure. There's one last webinar that Asian American Center for Advancing Justice will be conducting, and that is scheduled for next Monday, March 26th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this third webinar on March 26th will be covering poll monitoring. The webinar will cover how to organize poll monitoring efforts and how to carry those out on election day. Poll monitoring is basically recruiting and training volunteers to observe poll sites on election day. It's an important effort to that allows you to do a couple things. It allows you to try to get problems resolved on election day. And then secondly, it provides a way of assessing how well election officials are doing their job of providing language assistance. So that the third webinar on March 26th at 11 a.m. Pacific will cover this.
And for folks who learned about this webinar through our email blast, you'll also receive the email blast for when the link for that webinar will go up. Okay, I think we can wrap it up. If one last call for any questions that are burning or lingering. Okay, seeing none, well, I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their afternoon or morning for joining us on this webinar today. We hope it was useful. And again, if you have any further questions or would like to discuss any other issues for potential collaboration or just to learn more about the Asian American Centers for Advancing Justice voting rights work in this 2012 election, please feel free to contact us at our specific affiliates. Eugene Lee can be contacted at the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. Eugene, are you comfortable with your email address?
Yeah, go ahead and put it out into, I don't know if I can send it to all the attendees, so you should feel free to do that.
Okay. So Eugene's email is elee, so that's E-L-E-E at apalc, A-P-A-L-C.org.
And Carla, you should feel free to put that into the chat box. I don't think I have the ability to chat to all attendees, but I think you do, so you should feel free to put that in.
I will copy and paste that. And then, again, my name is Carla Del Cruz at the Asian Law Caucus, and if you have any questions regarding this webinar, just regarding copies of either the handbook or how to get copies of the PowerPoint, feel free to email me at carlod, as in David, at asianlawcaucus.org. Okay, well, again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to speaking or talking with you soon.